Hello and welcome to this concluding talk of the Radical Space in Between Disciplines conference, where I'm going to attempt to tie together the many and varied threads of the conference by reflecting on some of the chief concerns that you've raised over the past couple of days and comparing them with my own experience as an interdisciplinary theorist and practitioner. So for those of you, the majority of you who don't know me, I'm an academic writer and researcher whose work probes the intersections between theatre, architecture and scene design, what we call in Britain scenography, what you call here scene design. I'm a curator of exhibitions and events that combine architecture and performance, and that have included both the Prague Quadrennial 2011 and 2015. We just did it. God, I'm so confused. And also the Venice Architecture Biennale, where I curated an exhibit by Howard Tompkins architects. I'm a freelance theatre consultant and an educational consultant and practical workshop leader, currently working with children in disadvantaged inner city schools in London, as well as across different social sciences and arts and humanities departments in HE contexts. Between 2009 and 2011, I worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London inside the theatre and performance collections, and I worked there as an archivist and a researcher concerned primarily with spatial experimentation in post-war British theatre. Then, after that, I was lecturer in drama, theatre and performance at Queen Mary University of London, where I became increasingly interested not only in theatre architecture and non-traditional spaces of performance, but also in the politics of space, something that we've heard about a lot over the course of the couple of days that we've been here, in the performativity of architecture and the object world, and in what might be gained from thinking about theatre and architecture as, in some senses, analogous practices. I'm also co-convener of the International Federation for Theatre Research's Theatre Architecture Working Group, and that's a role I took up in 2010 when I redrew the group's mission statement to expand its interdisciplinary scope and enlarge its membership beyond the small number of mainly North American and European theatre historians who'd been talking to each other about theatre space, past and present, but also to expand it out towards practicing scenographers, advocates of spatial design, performance makers, theatre and performance theorists, and architects from every corner of the world. And that was a really, really big step for us. I think to this day, the IFTR working groups are almost exclusively populated by theatre and performance theorists and or practitioners. So we regularly have architects come and join that conference, and sometimes colleagues of theirs express surprise that they're flying across to the other side of the world to go and sit in a room for 5 days with a bunch of theatre historians. But we've both found it really, really productive, and I'm really committed to that way of working that is absolutely interdisciplinary and also absolutely international, because so often when you go to conferences, especially American and British conferences, it's the kind of usual Anglo-American suspects, and I'm really interested in hearing voices from other parts of the world and from different professional and intellectual fields. Okay, so I guess like most of you, I inhabit or try to inhabit that sort of uncertain in-betweenness where I'm constantly navigating between disciplinary points and trying to identify commonalities of approach and trying to understand how and why differences appear. Okay, so this is the first part of the talk that I'm going to give, which is really about the languages and relationships being forged within an expanded field of spatial thought and practice. When Miljana first tasked me with the job of reflecting on the conference as a whole and picking out some of the ideas that most struck me, I was really keen to know what new terms, new modes of thinking, and new techniques and tropes I would see emerging from other people's work. And I wanted to know in particular what these would tell me about the ways space is being conceived and practiced across and between the disciplines now. So I'm just going to take a short while to feed back to you about a number of themes and ideas that I saw recurring across panels and papers. First, what I noticed is that we're approaching questions of space as complex wholes that require the insights of several specialisms if we're going to grasp their multiple facets. Maja Gilas and Serjan Shušnitsa's analysis of ravaged cities in post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina serves as something of a provocation to architects and urban planners, in my view. It's clear from their study that any successful approach to the redesign of these war-torn cities will need to take account of human and political geography, history, the culture and politics of collective memory, and much else beside. For instance, they suggest in their abstract that we need to really kind of pay attention to the insights of war studies and or trauma studies, so kind of sub-disciplines in coming up with new architectural solutions. There's a strong sense in this work that only by folding these very various concerns into built projects can architects hope to honour past events and shared histories while validating individuals' feelings and experiences. But the shift that takes place not only in this study but in many of the papers offered by conference delegates is not simply a change in direction from thinking and practicing along straight disciplinary lines to the more convoluted but richer territory of interdisciplinarity. It is also a shift away from the old division between theory and practice and a plea to architects to meaningfully synthesize multiple theoretical perspectives with lived experience. And we've heard a lot about that. It's been a really important theme, lived space, lived experience, the social production of space. Oh, wrong way. Okay, second, we're understanding more about the framing and mediating effects that one discipline performs for and around another. The central claim of Ivana Marash's paper, as outlined in her abstract for this conference, is that the design of the modern city and the representation of the city through the medium of film are caught up in a reciprocal dance in which notions of space, time, and movement are conjoined. And what I really liked about Ivana's project is not only her suggestion that if real-world productions like architecture and spatial design are filtered through mimetic or representational arts and practices, specifically in her work today's cultural dominance of film, hard distinctions between the real and the fictional begin to break down. But that this breakdown is precisely what provides the opportunity for imagining alternate, improved urban environments. Because it's that breakdown, it's that destruction, to pick up on what Matthew said at the beginning of the last section, that leads us beyond the physical limitations of real city constructs. So out of destruction comes the possibility, the space opens up in which we can think about reconstruction. Third thing I noticed was that we are combining disciplines that have traditionally been centered on the study of space and thinking not merely between them, but through them to issues that lie beyond. For example, in Matthew Theismann's paper on cartographer James Wilde's Georama, the monster globe, architecture and cartography provide the means to think not only about spatial concepts and spatial perception, but also about social changes under the politico-economic systems of the modern imperialist world and the global sphere of late capitalism. Indeed, it is Matthew's suggestion that the architectural form that Wilde used to achieve his representation of the Earth as a singular connected surface anticipated, perhaps precipitated, those very changes by respatializing our perception and thus by shaping our social, political, and economic imaginations. So if I've understood this paper right, and it was difficult, it was really difficult to keep up with this. It was a fascinating paper, but it really taxed me with a heavy cold. So if I've understood it right, at the same time as inviting people into this novel and overtly theatrical space, the architecture of the monster globe is operating allegorically, that is, in a non-representational as well as representational way, as a diagram of political power, and is indeed producing those changes, those changing socio-spatial and political conditions ontologically. Fourth, and to shift the terms of my inquiry from theory and epistemology to practice, we're discovering new hybrid practices as a result of technological developments. I was unable to see Romana Boskovic and Dobrivoje Miljanovic's presentation. Sorry if I'm massacring your names, but I am determined to try and pronounce them. I missed this presentation on photosynthesis, which I'm very sorry about, actually, because I was really fascinated by the claim in the abstract that the productive combination of emerging technologies with post-dramatic performance theory posits new methodologies for making performance. By reconceiving technology not as ancillary, not as mere tech support, but as lying perhaps at the root of creativity and certainly theatrical possibility. Investigations such as this one challenge artistic hierarchies, something that you brought up in the earlier session, whilst also recalibrating the relationship between science, technology, and theatricality. And certainly I think that's the thrust of Mileka Stojicic's failed miserably there, argument that stage lighting, which was once simply the means to illuminate the actor, now enjoys a more independent role. And in fact, in a lovely allusion to Jacques Rancière's work on spectatorship, Milica uses the word emancipated to describe the repositioning of stage lighting at the center of the contemporary stage experience. Contemporary multimedia theatre, according to several of the contributions in the technological approach sessions and at other conferences where this theme has come up, as indeed it will increasingly come up, is the home of the emancipated design tool. So you've met the emancipated spectator, now meet the emancipated design tool. Emerging art practices, including light installations, telematic theatre, and other kinds of technologized performance, or performing technology, perhaps, pose complex questions about physical space and virtual reality, about movement and stasis, and about the co-imbrication of science and art, and old and new technologies. And here, I was there already. Here I want to just reference the work of Ars Electronica Future Lab, which we heard about from Dobrivoje and Chris, and which brings together the varying combinations of, I've got to take a deep breath here, architecture, biology, chemistry, graphics, informatics, art, media design, media technology, music, physics, sociology, and telematics in order to create its part live, part mediatized, immersive environments. And apologies if I've forgotten any disciplines that are represented in that extraordinary combination and coming together of people to test what might come out of the spaces in between formally discrete practices. Fifth, and leading directly on from that extraordinary range of not always obviously related specialisms represented by members of Future Lab, what I'm noticing is that we're prepared to venture into less familiar disciplinary terrain. So in place of the cross-disciplinary team, which might make use of the insights of distantly related subjects, but which will leave those disciplinary boundaries firmly in place, or in place of those brave souls belonging to a first generation of interdisciplinary endeavour, who might have enlarged the scope of their subject by acquainting themselves with the theories, methodologies, and practices of a cognate discipline, we are radically redefining our understandings of what certain aspects of our study are, and of how they act upon and are acted upon by other phenomena in ways that are deeply interrogative. And for me, it's the quality, the depth of interrogation of self, of discipline, of other, that is what constitutes a properly critical and rigorous interdisciplinarity. So that's where I'm coming from with that idea of interdisciplinarity. So in exploring space, voice, and the intensity of the vocal encounter, musicians Tijana Juricic and Andrea Pavlović go well beyond questions of acoustics, which would be the most obvious point of intersection between music and architecture, to ask questions about corporeality, affect, and space as a place of immanence where vocal encounters occur. So we've got two musicians. We've got an operatic soprano and a classically trained pianist wanting to come and talk to architects and engineers. I don't think I've ever been at a conference like that. And I think I want to pay tribute to the faculty here at Novi Sad, but also to see it as perhaps symptomatic of a new development in interdisciplinarity, where we're taking slightly larger steps, where we're being a little bit braver, and where we're prepared, we're prepared to encounter resistance or difficulty, but it's worth it in order to try and strike up those new conversations with people from really, really dissimilar areas and backgrounds. And similarly, Miljana and Višnja Jugic, who's here in spirit, I think, although busily head down writing up her thesis at the moment, and the rest of the Ephemera collective approach architecture and spatial design training through the medium of what looks very much to me as a theatre and performance person as site-specific performance, actually, availing themselves of the kinds of tools and exercises one would normally expect to see in a drama studio or rehearsal room. And in so doing, asking some searching questions about our expectations of architecture. What is its duration, for a start? And is it defined by its functionality, or might its social and communicative aspects be regarded as equally important? And there's a lot of other questions that this work asks, and the particular reason that I'm just referring to this work with that image is because it delighted me as a former archivist. Because this is a building, if you didn't sit in on the session, this is a building that various different people in the community are hoping to turn into a museum. I loved that these things these are found objects from within the house, and they were suspended on strings. And the English kind of bastardization of the word fonds, which is what we use to describe a particular hierarchy within the archive, comes from this word. The original word was string, and indeed archival artifacts were strung up rather than stored as they are today in boxes in strong rooms. So that was just a really lovely connection. I don't know how conscious it was, but there was something very museological going on about this, which added in yet another layer to this process of layering, delayering and relayering space performatively and through spatial design. Okay, what else will I take away from this conference on radical space in between disciplines? Well, there was a really noticeable concern with politics and ideologies of space. Coming from a very different cultural context, the UK, where most people are both politically pretty apathetic, although I have great hopes that this might be changing at the moment with the election of Jeremy Corbyn to leader of the Labour Party. But generally speaking, the British are pretty apathetic politically and pretty apathetic in terms of religion. And of course, we were a very multi-faith community, so it's a totally different context from the context here in Serbia today. And because of that, and because of my appalling ignorance about Serbian cultural history, I don't think I'll ever forget Sirjan now I can get this, don't tell me. Atanasovsky's, yes? Presentation about Belgrade's Orthodox Christian religioscapes. This was the lovely word that he used, religioscapes, and the architectural and sonic mechanisms by which Serbian national identity is built. And he talked about the way that the bells of of this new temple, Sant Sava, chimed out and actually kind of initiated a kind of a choreography of people stopping as they moved through public space to genuflect, and that the architecture, the religion, and indeed the kind of pride in Serbian nationhood then comes together, and it's represented on the stamp, just in case you were in any doubt about what being Serbian is all about. So that for me was really, really interesting. And what was more familiar to me, though, were the ones thinking about urban space in many other places around the world today as an architecture is standing at the kind of nexus of real estate, civic ideology, and the politico-economic management of the city. And given this state of affairs, what Vladan Peric's paper on the political messages of architectural chronotopes demonstrated for me was the need to ask not only how architecture, urban space, and everyday life encounter one another, but also what conditions that relationship and to what ends. Because it's only really from there that we can ask how we might be able to reframe space, finding in that gap or breach between civic imperatives and the places in which we live, ways to repoliticize the urban landscape. So alongside official designations of space, there were some really interesting tactical redeployments of space too. Another big theme was the theme of time. Sorry, I've kind of gone onto the wrong slide. No, I'm missing a slide. The theme of time. Imagine, if you will, because I'm missing a slide, the images from Jelena Todorović's lovely keynote lecture on the first evening. And if you know the work of W.G. Sebald, and you know the images that he includes in the Rings of Saturn, or perhaps even the Grant G. film that is a kind of riff or reverberation after Sebald, the film called Patience, which I thoroughly recommend. That several speakers argued for the need to integrate studies of space to time. Terms such as spatio-temporal are gaining currency in a variety of disciplines and interdisciplines that cut through both modalities, both the temporal and the spatial modality, and are alerting us to, and I'm going to pick out some words that Jelena used the other night, the polycentricity was one, and the temporal malleability of lived experience. And she reminded us about the beginning of the Rings of Saturn and the discussion about silkworms, and ended by kind of coming back round to that idea of this sort of thread of silk, this endlessness, this temporal and spatial endlessness that sort of unravels for her so beautifully. So it was really enjoyable to listen to Jelena's investigation of the legacy of the Baroque period on our present moment, to hear from a specialist in fine art and the Baroque, and to learn from her, from her way of seeing about contemporary psychogeographical literature. Finally, then, I just want to point out that the other big thing that I noticed was that ideas about the relationship between scenography and architecture were raised continually as well. In the first instance, by Sofia Lotka, in the context of curating the Prague Quadrennial. That's it there. And in the second place, by Slobodan Danko Selinkic, curator of the 2004 Serbian Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. So for Slobodan, architectural and scenographic strategies can be productively combined to form hybrid spaces. Spaces where each element can work with the other to enhance meanings or simply to solve annoying problems. So what do you do if your neighbouring exhibitor parks a food stand temptingly outside their national pavilion? Answer, you upstage them, of course. So we had this, he talked to us about what was he going to do. People weren't going to notice the Serbian pavilion because the Austrians had come up with this kind of gimmick for inviting people in, and he wasn't having any of that. So he rolled out the red carpet, and there was this lovely kind of meeting of scenography and architecture in order to lead people, to steer them towards the Serbian pavilion. And I thought that was great. That was so funny. And Sofia's notion of the performing exhibition as one that includes scenography in situ and live elements over which the curator has only partial control was really important to me for two reasons. In the first place, because it troubles common sense binaries such as animate/inanimate by demonstrating how space and objects themselves perform by doing, narrating and playing. But secondly, it harnesses human agency and the power of that unexpected reaction from a member of the viewing public to mitigate against the problem that any exhibition of scenography always risks falling flat on its face because it has taken the life, the performative context, out of the equation. And I know that this is something that Sodja really feels very passionate about, and it was one of the big paradoxes for her. How do you exhibit scenography? You can only really understand and appreciate scenography in performance. So she came up with these really interesting strategies, taking the scenography out onto the streets of Prague, and in that interaction between what she'd commissioned, the objects and costumes and what have you themselves, and members of the public who then interact, finding that the scenography comes back to life. While the spatial theories of Michel Foucault, Henri Lefebvre, and certain others continue to inspire work across our various arts, humanities, and social science projects, there's also considerable interest in Deleuzian notions of immanence and rhizomatic space, as well as in Bruno Latour's networks, and also in the study of nomadology and the new mobilities paradigm. As we press further into the 21st century and our academic and professional practices explore space in terms of the dynamics of its use, explore space we start to feel more the influence of the social and performative terms. I think we're increasingly likely to explore space in terms of the dynamics of its use and in terms of users' needs and or the experiences of space. That was something that kind of struck me particularly. It came out of a lot of papers and was articulated very clearly by Katarina Stojanovic, who reminded us that the core need for architecture as shelter means that spatial design is about people's habits and needs, i.e. sociology, or nothing at all. I've arrived at a bit where I just want to pause briefly and include a very, very brief consideration of the spatial conditions that are currently aiding or else endangering interdisciplinary experiment and research into questions of space. And I guess the key question lying behind this for me is quite simply, how free is the space for the production of knowledge? Well, if there's anything that cross and interdisciplinary interaction teaches us, it's that the attributes of sameness and difference that we come up with are variable, contextual, and highly charged. So I won't attempt to speak for different places and peoples, but I'll limit this next set of points that I want to make to my experience of being an interdisciplinary scholar in the UK. So in Britain today, on the one hand, university web pages are really keen to promote the rhetoric of interdisciplinarity, but on the other, managers find it easier to sell students degrees when the degree subjects are clearly defined and well recognised. So we're really pulling in two directions there. National funding bodies, such as the Arts and Humanities Research Council, positively encourage such research through targeted calls for projects and through money. Let's face it, that's what it usually comes down to. Yet the QAA and HEFCE, which are both bodies that assess universities and fund them, money again, impose institutional constraints on interdisciplinarity. Research assessment exercises, including the UK's new Research Excellence Framework, claim to recognise the worth of interdisciplinary publications, and yet they've largely been managed and controlled by single-discipline teams, and those publications are themselves largely marketed in terms of discrete disciplines. Even the Handbook for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, which is the UK's standard industry guide, contains large general sections pitched to readers of all disciplines. And then it also contains a very large special section that is subdivided into parallel discipline-specific chapters. But it contains no help or advice on the subject of interdisciplinarity or an index entry for interdisciplinarity anywhere over its many hundreds of pages. As general medic and interdisciplinary theorist Elizabeth Cheng argues, we compartmentalize ourselves off in our departments, talking to people who think the same way we do. We begin preaching to the choir and feel affirmed that our style of thought is the only right way. The way in which we are trained and specialized shapes our identity and how we process the world beyond our academic disciplines. Not only do we develop specialized knowledge, but we also become inculcated in a particular way of examining and talking about the world that breeds distrust against other approaches and a belief that our methodology is the best. End quote. Zheng's solution, and that of several other commentators on interdisciplinarity in higher education settings, is to rethink the layout of the university campus among more collegiate, interdiscipline-friendly lines. The idea is that by bringing researchers and students from dissimilar schools and departments into much more frequent social contact with each other, universities could actually use the spaces of their buildings to foster new collaborative partnerships and enhanced awareness of and respect for the subjects, methodologies, and practices of others. And I think this is a really lovely idea, but it's one that I don't see happening in most universities anytime soon for obvious financial and logistical reasons. So what do we do in the meantime? Well, in the meantime, the international conference circuit offers one of the most exciting opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration and knowledge exchange. So, I really can't thank the organisers of Radical Space enough because of the inclusive and open-minded vision that you had for this conference. But for me, what are even more important than the institutional spaces of university buildings or the international conference circuit that tends to be, at least at its top levels, it tends to be imagined in discrete disciplinary form, is the kind of the actions of individuals, the sort of the time spaces that we ourselves carve out, the ways that we reroute things, the way that we repurpose things in order to prioritize our intellectual curiosity about each other's practices and perspectives. And it's in this context that I want to sketch out an interdisciplinary experiment that I was lucky enough to have been able to lead and take part in this summer. So this grew out of IFTR. I'm just going to, literally just introduce you to it very briefly. But this is an example for me of academics and practitioners from different disciplines using an existing structure that may be discipline specific and finding a space and, repurposing things in order to do what we want to do. Shared Methodologies was a series of 4 experimental labs which were put together by my frequent collaborator and IFTR co-convener Andrew Filmer and I in a room made available to us at this year's Prague Quadrennial. So thanks are also due to Sodja and Marketa and the good folks at the Prague Quadrennial who responded to our request that we just want a large empty space because we want to do something, we want to test drive something. It's not that often, even with research allocation and budgets to pay for your travel, it's not that often that we can get together as a group from Brazil, from Turkey, from Serbia, from Canada, and the States and the UK, and really use our time and use that space in the way that we want to. The labs grew out of a roundtable discussion, various roundtable discussions in the IFTR Theatre Architecture Working Group, and they were designed to test in practice our members' curiosity about the affordances and the limitations of training in each of the working groups to major disciplines, that's theatre or performance and architecture, and also to test out and further explore spatial practices within, across and between disciplines. Performance is a toolbox of collaborative methods and techniques, including devising, improvising, storytelling, acting or not acting, and reacting, working and reworking material, questions architecture's presumed autonomy as a discipline, and critiques its dominant training methods. However, there is still more work that could be done in this area. The significance of architecture for theatre and performance pedagogy, on the other hand, is a nascent field. Although many university drama courses appreciate the need for classes on scenography and technical theatre, very, very few offer the chance to study drama and theatrical performance in relation to theatre architecture, or even teach basic stage types. And drama students in the UK continue to lag far behind students of dance in terms of their spatial awareness. And this is really, really problematic. So to state the problem that we've posed ourselves for these workshops in a nutshell, both disciplines need to think about and teach approaches to space. But there was a feeling amongst group members that approaches to space in architecture education had perhaps become a little habitual in some countries, in some institutions, and that questions about how to relate to architecture space and how to structure and build a piece of performance were being largely avoided altogether. So here's what we did. This is Beth Weinstein, who chairs the Master of Architecture program at the University of Arizona. And it was Beth's idea that she really wanted to challenge the development of spatial propositions through allographic means or through scalar sketches, drawings and models of work to be enacted by others in the future. And instead what she did was she designed a workshop that involved participants in live full-scale prototyping of spatial propositions, and where there'd be a special focus on the body's engagement with matter and with developing choreographies of space. So we were just testing this between us. So we're all teachers, researchers, but we would take part in each other's workshops as if we were students, in order that workshop leader could just go, look, this is something that I'm not sure of. It may work, it may not work. I want to try it out. So performers and architects together devised, constructed and deconstructed, as well as performed space using a deliberately limited range of simple materials. So, I mean, string, sellotape, cardboard boxes, right? And working physically to explore the different ways that space might be articulated. So one of the things that Beth encouraged us to do was to think about, we were building some kind of construction within an existing space. So we were responding to the architecture of the room in which the work was taking place. That's one thing which I think you can see clearly demonstrated here. But another thing was that she didn't tell us that she was going to do this, she had us really exploring materials, taking them to pieces, using them in all sorts of counterintuitive ways. And then after we did that and made one construction, she'd go, okay, now you need to reassemble the cardboard boxes. And then we did it again, and we had to rebuild using the same materials various times over. And then she had us performing the process of those kind of modest architectural interventions. The workshop I co-designed with Andrew Todd, who's director of one of Europe's leading young architecture and scenography practices based in Paris, Studio Andrew Todd, had a dual aspect. and was strongly problem-led. So whereas Andrew's concern was with how to encourage architecture students away from deterministic space planning and assumptions about the rules for composition that can shut down the creative process in architecture, my chief concern was that students learning how to make devised performance should be provided with a set of spatial and constructional tools with which to generate and develop a much more integrated approach to dramaturgy and scenography than is often the case in contemporary theatre work, despite the spatial turn that has taken place in theatre and performance studies and the rise of genres like site-specific theatre and various other kinds of found space practice. So we were using just very simple kind of micro improvisations and using our bodies to explore particular kind of qualities or atmospheres, to play with them, not in any kind of literal or narrative sense, but in order to try and understand the physicality of something, like, for instance, contemplation or conflict or various different qualities like this. So people would make images, make kind of tableau vivant with their bodies, or make micro improvisations along this theme, and then work at 1 to 20 scale to say, well, how can we extrapolate out from that physical exercise in improvisation, and actually use that as a starting point for thinking about the quality that the corresponding space might have. So you saw the three figures doing this improvisation with absolutely no prior knowledge that they were going to then go and have to build the spatial container for that straight after. And then from there we started to think, and this is something that's, it was hopelessly ambitious. I couldn't possibly roll this out in a 2-hour session, but over a longer period of time, i.e. a full 6-week course in something like devised performance composition, what I would like to do is then give performance students the skills that they usually lack actually in drama departments of scenography, scenic design, and actually skills of making, so that they can make the scenography themselves, rather than thinking of it as a kind of last minute, oh God, what are we going to do for a set? And it's a stick-on. So I want them to develop the scenography at the same time as the performance and be able to make it themselves. But I also think it might be useful for them to look at some of the things that they've made, look at some of the ways in which you might put two things together, and think about what connects them. What lies between those two things? Is it a ramp? Is it a bridge? Is it a void? And then extrapolate back into performance, because they're quite good at producing little kind of moments of performance, like a 5-minute idea in performance. But they're not sure then how to connect that performance starting point and make a more kind of satisfying, complex whole. Something that will stand up, that will be rigorous, that will have a structure in the same way that all good architecture students know that, hey, guess what? Your building needs to stand up, all right? Because otherwise people are going to die. Performance students are terrible like that, because there aren't the same life and death consequences. And so when they make devised performances, there may be many things that are really, really imaginative and risk-taking about their work, but quite often in a post-dramatic world where we've thrown out the kind of rule book for how to structure a piece of performance, their piece is kind of structurally a bit like that. It all goes a bit saggy, and I need for them to think more like architects. Simon Persighetti, who you see here, and Kathy Turner, of the British performance collective Rights and Sights, invited participants in their workshop to explore their notion that human movement, specifically walking or pedestrian practice, through urban space always responds to, transforms, resists, or in some way completes the city's architecture, and is as such part of a spatial dramaturgy that might be further investigated by performance makers and architects. By working with or against the city's cues, Simon and Kathy led us through a series of observations and interventions where we noted the dance of walkers up and down stone steps, or redirected our attention to things we might not otherwise have seen. We also sometimes redirected the attention of passers-by into unfamiliar corners of the city, and we reappropriated space for our own totally unauthorized use, suggesting these kind of new and tactical patterns of urban inhabitation through things like the use of this kind of portable signage. So there's Kathy, there are people walking up and down this street wondering what on the earth this woman's doing, talking to this statue. And there's Edvard from Brazil, feeling the cold and the rain in Prague. And people would come up and interact with us while we were wearing these signs in ways that obviously just does not otherwise happen if you happen to be sitting for a moment as he is and just resting like that. So we found ways of getting people involved in kind of impromptu performances through this process. Here are, I love that, a confused looking architect with the question mark there, and a colleague from Greece who's just looking upwards like that. And of course everybody then gathers around and goes, what's she looking at? And there we were, all just sitting down and sort of just test driving what happens, how might we as performers or as architects want to think about what happens if a group of people just decides that maybe what's needed in this space is a pile of chairs. How would that alter the flow of pedestrian traffic in that area? What does that do to time? What does it do to social interactions? You see where I'm going with this? I love that. That's my favourite. That's my co-convener, Andrew Filmer, who's suddenly taken on what looks like an official role. And I think that man's just wondering whether he needs to ask him permission to enter the building, or so just getting people to think about practices of these sort of post-situationist practices and pedestrian practices in the city, and what can we take out of those and use either as architects or as performers. And one more, finally, here is the Ephemera Collective. This was the last of the workshops, and this is where Ephemera led us on an exploratory site-based workshop where they extended the principles of delayering that they've developed with students on the ephemeral architecture and architectural design courses here. Drawing on a variety of different theatre and performance games, Ephemera sensitized participants to the phenomenal qualities of space and to space as an immersive experience. And we really went on quite a long blindfolded walk like this, and it takes you into a completely different experiential space when you do that. I've noticed this in site-specific performance where sometimes performers have done something similar with audience members. But this was some difficult and lengthy and potentially hazardous walk. I think we were blindfolded for, what was it, 10, 15 minutes, or was it more? It felt like an eternity, and when I emerged, I didn't know what realm I was inhabiting. I'd gone into the twilight zone somewhere. But of course, then what you hear and you feel things. And I guess the point about that is that performance makers, to some extent, and architects, I think, to a greater extent, perhaps over-rely on the sense of sight. So it was a really nice way of thinking about what are some of the other qualities that we need to just attune ourselves to when we think about the design of space or when we think about performing in space. So from that point, from a point of sort of very highly subjective discovery, we worked both individually and collaboratively to creatively reassemble the layers of an abandoned office building on the outskirts of Prague, weaving together space, place, narrative, and ambience to mark the site with a new layer of meaning. I'm just going to flick through some of these. I think they speak for themselves. So each of these workshops was hybrid, provisional, unstable, iterative. Like so many of the theoretical and practice-based research projects that we've heard about over the course of the past 48 hours, they were motivated by a deep desire to enhance spatial awareness and to avoid the complacency of received disciplinary frameworks. Typically, workshop leaders formulated guerrilla practices of adopting, adapting, translating, appropriating, purloining, and testing through doing. Like a practice-based research cycle, the workshops yielded a number of important insights, but raised a still larger number of questions of space. Some goals were readily achieved, others less so. The important thing was the creation of a safe space, a space in which workshop leaders and participants were given the right to fail. And I really believe in that. At a time when student fees are rising in many countries worldwide and academics are coming under pressure to produce saleable modules, this was a bottom-up, totally unfunded moment, grabbed between jobs and family commitments and travel, in which to test drive ideas for teaching and to give and receive constructive, supportive feedback. So by way of conclusion, I just really want to reflect on the thought that it would probably be far easier to stick within the recommended guidelines, to talk to others who share our educational backgrounds, so we don't need to worry about translating ourselves, to teach the university courses that have already been passed through the validation processes and are perfectly okay without having to worry about what other people are doing. But developments in the disciplines of theatre and architecture and their attendant professional practices, as well as in the other disciplines represented by audience members here, are significantly significantly conditioned by the ways in which they are taught. And for those of us interested in promoting a genuinely critical interdisciplinarity within and beyond the academy, the issue how we might best enable the theorists and practitioners of tomorrow to critique and think outside the norms of society and their chosen material practice or profession is essential for the formation of active citizens. Contemporary spatial conditions are evolving. Consequently, those of us engaging students of any kind of spatial practice will want to help those students find new ways of describing, communicating, intervening in, shaping and performing space within this changing context. And it's that kind of intergenerational thing. It's that sense of what we owe to the next generation that for me makes it important not merely to indulge my personal preference as someone who's always been quite intellectually polygamous in interdisciplinarity, but to make a firm commitment actually, that where this goes next has to be into thinking about how I then take that interest, those practices, that research into my teaching. That's it. Thank you very much.